So, Bobby, tell me, when did you and Jimmy Page first meet?
Jimmy Page and I first met around 1962. I was doing a gig I was with a group called Joe Brown and the Brothers. We had a very big hit called A Picture of You. And we were playing, I think it was Aylesbury Town Hall, was the first time I ever saw Jimmy. Our support band for that night was a band called Neil Christian and the Crusaders. And Jimmy was a guitar player with him. Oh, okay. Couldn't have been very old. He probably wasn't much more than about 16, something like that. And I remember thinking I was really amazed with him. He was such a wonderful player. For somebody so young, he had this wonderful, wonderful feel. That was the very first time that I ever saw Jimmy, and then we lost touch for a little while, and then in '63, I think, both of us sort of started to get more and more onto the professional session scene and started working together, and we ended up, of course, working on literally hundreds of recordings.
Okay, do you remember the first one that you worked on together with him?
I think the first one that I ever worked with Jimmy Page was a song called Do the Bird, which was by the Vernon's Girls. And there was a young arranger called Mike Leander who also had heard about Jimmy and heard about me and started to put together what later became the Musical Stuntmen, as we used. I nicknamed us the Musical Stuntmen because we did all the dangerous bits for the artists, like playing the right beats and the right chords and things. And we, of course, ended up playing virtually on almost everything that was ever issued in the 1960s. The guys were on it, and that was Jimmy Page, Big Jim Sullivan on guitar, Alan Whale on bass guitar, Eric Ford on bass guitar, Arthur Greenslade on piano, or Ronnie Price on piano. It varied, but generally the nucleus was
there was a group of you.
Guys, yeah.
What was the difference between Jimmy's playing style and Big Jim Sullivan's?
Well, Jim Sullivan had already been on sessions for some time. I think he'd already been in for a couple of years or more. And Jimmy was very raw, just the same as I was. We came into sessions, neither of us could read music. And Jim Sullivan was just starting to learn to read, and he could read quite well when we came in. So he was more being dictated to by what was written on the chart than we were, because we just had to play as we felt it. Now, for a drummer, it's not too difficult. You can get away with it. You can bluff it if you need to. But for a guitarist, it's totally different, because he's playing notes. You can't just play notes all over the place. But Jimmy had this great ear, and he would listen to the run-through, the rehearsal, and then it would be locked in almost. And he knew exactly what he would do. People like Mike Leander never wrote parts for Jimmy Page. Or for me even, they just he gave Jimmy chord sheets to follow, so he knew what the chords were and he would work out from them. And for Big Jim, and Vic Flick and the other guys that could read, they were given the notations. Jim wasn't, and I certainly never was. In fact, they used to write my drum parts for me, but gave up after a while because I could never read them. So they just used to put the words "fill in." And my trick was to use earphones. I was one of the first drummers ever to use earphones, so I could hear what the singer was doing. And basically, whenever the singer stopped to take a breath, I filled it in. Simple as that, really. I was very heavily influenced by a man called Hal Blaine, the American drummer from the Phil Spector Wrecking Crew. And I borrowed some of Hal's little licks, and I borrowed some of the Buddy Rich little licks, and I borrowed from everybody and put them all together, and that's how the Bobby Graham style came about, really. It was a mixture of so many different drummers. The difference between Big Jim and Little Jim, as they were called, was very simply the fact that Big Jim was a wonderful, and still is a wonderful guitar player, technically, brilliant guitar player. Little Jim perhaps didn't have quite the technique, but he had that feel which was so important to those records at that time. It was so desperately needed, because before then it had just been studio musicians reading from charts. Now, if you ever listen to Cliff Richard's Move It, The guitar player on that, I think, was a man called Ernie Shear. Very fine musician, could read everything. But the solo on it, I mean, really, it was a bit weak because it was the first rock and roll solo. I don't think he really knew what he was doing. He's always been hailed as a wonderful solo, but it is a bit of a strange old solo, to say the least. Then when you hear Jimmy Page doing solos, there's a hell of a difference.
He put life into him, didn't he?
Oh,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Yeah, a lot of passion in his play.
Oh, absolutely. Magic.
Even though he was called One Take Jimmy, wasn't he?
Yeah, but, I mean, it wasn't always one takes, I can tell you. Sometimes we did a lot. I mean, you've got to remember, it's not only us that were on the session, other musicians, string players and things like that, and they made mistakes, so we had to do it again. You know, we never always did things in one takes. There are certain recordings which were done in one take. One comes to mind was Brenda Lee. She came over to England to do a session at Decca Records, which Jimmy Page, Jim Sullivan and myself were on. And there was a problem in the control box, a piece of equipment. So we were sort of just really messing about in the studio, and we started to play What Did I Say by Ray Charles, and Brenda joined in with us. And Mickey Moster was producing the session. Just at that moment they got the machine working, so he taped it, and that came out as the B-side to Is It True? And that was definitely a one-taker. It was just a bust-up.
So was it more fun or stressful in the studio, or did it vary from take to take or album to album?
It varied from session to session, because we never knew what sessions we were going to be on, because the guy who rang you up and fixed you for the sessions, the fixer, would ring up and he'd say, Bob, I want you there at 10 till 1 tomorrow at Decca No. 2 Studios. And I used to say to him, Charlie, who's the artist? And you know what? He would never tell us. And he used to say, don't ask for the names of the higher-ups, please, Bob. It's just true.
Oh, wow.
You were never allowed to ask who the musical director was. You were never allowed to ask who the artist was. So you didn't know whether you were going into a group session or a film session where there might be a 60, 70-piece orchestra sitting there. You just didn't know.
So very different from today.
Well, yeah, very different. I mean, especially nowadays, of course, not many session musicians are actually used on sessions now. String players certainly are a thing of the past almost, unless they're doing a film session like Lord of the Rings or something like that, where a full orchestra is required. Yeah. But generally speaking, most pop records, the strings are keyboards nowadays.
Synthesizer.
Yeah.